and welcome to Take Two, the show that takes a second look at current events. I'm Ian Henshall. In this programme, we'll be starting with some news stories you might have missed. We get a report from Roy Hunter on the developments in Ukraine. And finally, we're pleased to welcome a visitor, Vijay Mehta of Uniting for Peace, who have a London conference on Saturday the 28th of March. Tony Benn, anti-war campaigner and a genuine liberal, passed away earlier this month. We on RADTV would like to pay our respects to the legendary UK politician Tony Benn, who died earlier this month. Tony came from a liberal family and swung naturally behind the Labour Party when it still promoted social justice and an end to empire. Unlike New Labour, he never bought into the theory that human rights can be opposed with bombs, and in recent years he found himself more at home with peace activists than mainstream politicians, which he once was. He called for an independent inquiry into the 9/11 attacks, but did not go on to make the issue a priority. Tony Benn was up to his death president of UK's Stop the War, and this is what they said on their website. Everywhere you went with Tony, people came up and spoke to him. Doormen, taxi drivers, shopkeepers and people in the street wanted to shake his hand. He was loved by millions for his straightforward talking and for his opinions, which chimed more with theirs than the mainstream politicians did. We will miss Tony profoundly, but we are determined to continue fighting for the cause of peace, which was so important to him. US-Ukraine poll shows media and politicians out of touch. A poll from the respected Pew Research shows that US media and politicians have virtually no public support over Ukraine. Just a few days after belligerent US Secretary of State John Kerry said all options are on the table, only 8% thought that military options should even be considered. There was even a 2-to-1 majority against, quotes, the US taking a firm stand against Russian actions, end of quotes. Here in the UK, it is noticeable that newspapers are rarely putting the Ukraine crisis on their front pages, an indication that their readers are not interested. One of the most warlike is the strongly pro-EU Guardian. Ironically, in a mirror image of the secession of Crimea, the Guardian supported the bombing of Kosovo by NATO to allow Kosovo to secede. However, the most belligerent Americans in the Pew poll were those who said they have been following events closely. So Washington can take comfort in the ability of its media to hoodwink its own public, but only so long as they still keep taking the media's Kool-Aid. How much longer that will be in the case of the modern world is not at all clear. Saudi Arabia may be changing tack on the Syrian war. The Syrian government has long said that the repercussions of using Al-Qaeda to try to overthrow Assad will reach far beyond Syria, and they're proving to be correct about that. First, as we reported, there has been a palace coup in Qatar, hard to penetrate but linked somehow to the failed attempt to topple the secular Syrian regime. It was widely reported at the time that Saudi Arabia would now take over sponsorship of the insurgency, but things there may have changed too. Reports suggest that as the Assad government gains ground, the Saudis are taking steps to extinguish the fire they've been fueling. Western media have been reporting Saudi plans to step up arming the Syrian insurgency, but they have plenty of arms already, courtesy of NATO and Turkey. Perhaps more significantly, the French news agency Agence France Presse reports via the Lebanese Daily Star that Saudi Arabia has ordered all of its citizens fighting abroad to return within 15 days or face imprisonment. If you read the report carefully, it is clear that the Saudis are not just referring to Al-Qaeda, but also those fighting for the supposedly more moderate groups. And then, in the Kurdish areas of Syria, the Assad regime seems to have given a measure of de facto independence, and the Kurds have joined the battle against the jihadists. No doubt the Kurds, once victorious, will later turn on their Turkish oppressors. So that's a bit of repercussion for Turkey. Meanwhile, in Turkey, which provides training and logistical support for the insurgency, Prime Minister Recep Erdogan has seen his standing decline since the high point when he appeared to be standing up to Israel. Now he is running a bloody campaign against the Assad government, Israel's most feared enemy. How they must be smirking in Tel Aviv. Key point of money reformers now accepted by the Bank of England. Banks take deposits from savers and then lend them out, right? No, wrong. They lend out far more than they have in deposits, and this is how the economy is lubricated with the money it needs for smooth running. In their recent quarterly bulletin, the bank concedes what the global banking community, indeed the whole capitalist world, are reluctant to admit. We have entrusted the creation of money to the commercial banking sector. And there are several problems with doing that. Unlike a publicly run bank or currency, banks charge interest on the loans that they create, guaranteeing them massive profits. In this sense, the banks are levying a stealth tax on the whole economy. Maybe the Bank of England is admitting this because, unlike the US Fed, it is not a private entity, it's publicly owned and should be operating in the public interest. Banks got the job of creating the money the economy needs by persuading us that politicians can't be trusted, which a lot of people might agree with, but then they got Western governments to relax regulations so that the global banking now looks more like a mafia-run casino. But that's not the only problem. The very last thing that a big bank is interested in is to help small businesses with new ideas. Why fund 10 new small businesses when you can make one loan to a too-big-to-fail arms corporation? It's not just the cut they're taking, it's who they choose to lend their newly created money to, say public banking campaigns like Positive Money here in the UK, or Ellen Brown, the Green politician standing for Treasurer in California, who we've reported on in the past. 9/11 debate at Kent University. It's unusual for supporters of the official 9/11 story to offer anything much more constructive than abuse and threats towards 9/11 skeptics, so we're pleased to announce that a debate has been organised in Canterbury here in the UK on the 1st of April, courtesy of a student who adamantly believes the official 9/11 story. All are welcome to attend. The motion is 9/11 was an inside job. Speaking for the motion will be Niels Harrit, an eminent scientist from Denmark, and myself. Niels will be arguing that spectacular building collapses must have been aided by insiders. I will be saying that though it's difficult to fathom exactly what happened, given the many glaring impossibilities of the official 9/11 story, it must have been some sort of an inside job. For more information, please go to the reinvestigate911.org website, reinvestigate911.org. Well, it's Ukraine again, and there's lots more to tell about it. We don't think we're going to have time to look at it every issue. You've just heard how polls are indicating that the public have not caught war fever from the media and the Western politicians. I've got Roy Hunter in the studio, our Ukraine researcher and expert. And so, Roy, you know, what's new? Obviously, we can't talk about the very latest events because this is a pre-recorded show. But sure. You know, in the background, you know, how do you see things have moved over the last few weeks?
Well, I think it's all it has calmed down a little bit, and things are no longer moving at crisis speed, and things have slowed down, and they're developing slowly, and it's much easier to get a target on. And as you mentioned in one of your news shorts there. There is no consensus among the Western populations that it's a good thing to do, really. I think Putin's quite well respected, I think, amongst the publics here, far more than Obama is. I think certainly amongst anybody with any kind of political savvy, Putin comes across as a statesman, doesn't he? Because that's exactly what he is. And Obama comes across as a puppet of Wall Street, because that's exactly what he is, really.
And you were mentioning that Saakashvili in Georgia, you know, they're not worried about him rigging his elections? Or
Well, I mean, this is the difference, isn't it? This shows the duplicity of the West, really, because when Saakashvili was, when he rigged his election and everybody in Georgia protested against it, this was back in 2008, 2009, the West denounced the protesters, you know. Whereas Yanukovych, who won a fair election in 2010, and not only did he win a fair election, but he was also willing to bring the next election forward, which he'd arranged to do.
he made loads of concessions.
Oh, loads of concessions.
Which they just swallowed up and threw in his face.
But he brought the next election forward to May, which is not very far away. You know, people could have waited quite easily. And of course, the supporters there were not only supported by the West morally, but well, it turns out as well, it looks very much like the Americans were, through their NGOs, were supporting the snipers and all the neo-fascist groups there.
Well, I was just gobsmacked when I saw the Observer newspaper, which is, you know, it's always been very pro-Israel and, you know, had a very sort of Jewish element in it, you know. It's calling it a revolution in Ukraine. They didn't seem to realise that the people running, some of the people running that revolution were the very same people, you know, the grandsons of the SS officers who helped the Nazis exterminate Jews in Europe, you know, and you'd think that Netanyahu might have had something to say about it, but
I don't think. I think it's all part of the agenda, isn't it? I don't think there's any
principles.
Principles, indeed. Yeah. Yes.
So now, you know, they're claiming. You know, the Russian side are claiming that international observers are saying it was a fair vote in Crimea.
Yeah, absolutely.
But were they just a few people they got in that happened to be international, or were they, you know, from the OSCE or
they were from lots of independent countries, really. I think a lot of the election overseers are from independent countries. They don't do it through the UN or anything like that.
Yeah, I mean, there's not much doubt that the Crimeans, the vast majority of the Crimeans, I don't think anybody's
Well,
denying
we had an
the vast
82% turnout of people eligible to vote, and out of those 82%, 96.7% voted, and you know that looks dead suspicious, doesn't it? You know, normally you'd say, well, you know, that's Putin. Because numbers that high are very rarely reached in fair elections. But, you know, the international community have said they were fair elections. And, you know, the mainstream press would have you believe that the Tatars didn't want the Russians in there, and, the East Ukrainians didn't want the Russians to be part of Russia. But, you know, those numbers speak for themselves. Well, in 1999, Kosovo was bombed, or Serbia was bombed for 78 days by NATO.
Because they wouldn't let Kosovo go independent.
That's right. Yeah.
In exactly the same way that Crimea now wants
That's
to go
right.
independent.
And Crimea has done it democratically through a referendum, and Kosovo didn't happen like that. You know, we just bombed the Serbs until they said, okay.
So if Russia behaved like NATO, they would now be bombing Ukraine and demanding that Ukraine do what they want, basically.
Well, demanding that Ukraine let go of Crimea.
Let go of Crimea and officially signed a treaty.
But now the EU are also racing for deals with Georgia and Moldova as well. You know, they're trying to accelerate this. You know, this has been going on slowly since the fall of the Berlin Wall, really, since the demise of the Soviet Union. You know, even though we had agreements when the Soviet Union demised, that we wouldn't expand NATO eastward. That's been happening again and again and again and again.
Probably
slowly.
Gorbachev's most terrible mistakes in not getting that in a treaty form.
Well, no, it was in a treaty form. This is
was
what
it
I'm
really?
saying.
It's an actual treaty.
Yeah. So they seem to now be wanting to move this agenda forward. So. You know, the neocons basically who are running this, of course, are trying to get more deals done, and we have McCain, Senator McCain, who's one of the loveliest, fluffiest people on the planet. He's calling for Obama to send arms and other military equipment to Ukraine, saying that if he was the president, he would have already done that.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, McCain, I heard him saying, and I wouldn't have credited this if they didn't actually have the voice in live, his actual voice saying it. He said, well, if we've got all these weapons, why aren't we using them?
Another quote from him is, NATO should fully exploit the situation to prepare for the expansion of the alliance to include countries such as Georgia and Montenegro as soon as possible. So he's pushing for it. And Kiev are asking NATO for arms now. So,
right.
you know, I mean, have you seen the state of Syria lately? You know,
yeah.
the place is just...
Ukraine could turn into another
well,
Syria.
I think it will. I mean, Libya has, hasn't it?
Yeah.
Libya has, Syria has. Ukraine's got to be next, surely.
Well, they're going to try and capture the rest of Ukraine peacefully if they can, presumably. But what happens if there's an uprising in eastern Ukraine?
Well, this is what I'm saying. You know, the fascist elements, and they are fascist elements. Let's not, you know, the fascists are now in government. Really, this is the first time since the Second World War we've had an openly fascist government. Really. And they are calling for arms from.
And they're starting a so-called National Guard, which is presumably not going to allow any Russian speakers into it.
No. Well,
which could be a very, very
well. Russian will be
SS
illegal
type.
there soon, of course, so there won't be any Russian speakers.
Are they? Is this really true?
Well, a lot of what has happened in a lot of these eastern countries that have gone EU NATO way. The Russian population becomes second-class citizens really within those countries. Most of them actually leave and go back to Russia, but and all that trouble starts. They get led into being second-class citizens, and the first reason of that is because Russia becomes not the. I'm not saying it's illegal, but it becomes a secondary language, a non-official language. So it's not spoken in the parliaments. It's not spoken in the bureaucracies. So if you're a Russian, you're no longer part of the establishment unless you speak the local language.
So it's a huge way of creeping marginalisation of a population.
Yeah.
Would it mean, I mean, this is a difficult question, perhaps you don't know, but are they basically saying in Ukraine now that if you're sort of getting unemployment benefits, you've got to fill in all the forms in Ukrainian and not in Russian? Is that the sort of way it happens?
Yeah, I don't really know, but that's kind of the, yeah, if it's not the official language, then it is not officially acceptable.
And they've been criticised even by the OSCE, which is pretty Western controlled. They've been criticised for blocking TV channels.
Yeah, they're doing that, Russian TV channels now. And it really is, there's a real fascist agenda going on here, and you know, the West are quite happy to support them. You know, we're quite happy to support Islamic jihadists, you know, or neo-fascists. We're happy to support anybody who'll do our bidding.
Do what we want.
Do our bidding for us, really. Yeah. The right sector is a party called the Right Sector, and led by a guy called Yarosh, and they've only been going since November 2013, so they're almost come out with the protests here. But he's now part of the government. He's come in as not quite defence minister, but something around there, and he's been seen on TV. There's a Russian-speaking TV executive. And he was seen there beating this guy to force him into signing a letter of resignation.
Really?
Yeah. And he's threatened to destroy the pipelines. He's saying, well, Russia's oil comes through Ukraine. Let's destroy their pipelines. And now the Right Sector, which is a lot of the... they were responsible for a lot of the violence during the protests, are now being... subsumed into the government as part of a regular military unit now.
Yeah.
So now we've got a fascist.
Officially, so I've seen that's been.
Yeah. And so within the military, there's now, it's bound to be a separate unit. So there's a fascist separate unit now.
I can't help laughing at the irony of it, but this is pretty much exactly what Hitler did when he took
absolutely.
over Ukraine, isn't it? He found some local Nazis who hated Jews and elevated them all to. Sort of in the SS. There was a whole section of the SS was made up of Ukrainians, sort of honorary Germans, and now they're honorary NATO members. Well, thanks very much, Roy. We'll have to see how things develop.
Thank you.
Well, I'm pleased to welcome to the studio Vijay Mehta, who's the author of this book, The Economics of Killing, How the West Fuels War and Poverty in the Developing World. And Vijay is also the leader of an organisation called Uniting for Peace. So Vijay, can you tell us a little bit about Uniting for Peace?
Yeah, it's been going, Uniting for Peace has been going on for 34 years. And we have very distinguished academics, Nobel Prize winners, lords, members of parliament, cabinet ministers, Even Tony Benn, who just recently died, he was one of our patrons. And we do conferences, meetings, we promote culture of peace, poverty reduction, protection of human rights. There's some of the things we do. And we spread word of peace, we take actions for peace, we do lobbying in the parliament and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, because peace is important, you know, because human rights doesn't always mean peace. Human rights nowadays can mean dropping bombs, you know, so it's a funny old world. And you've got a big conference coming up as well in the next few weeks.
Yes, I've got a big conference coming up on Saturday, 29th of March at Wesley Chapel, and it is about Syria. That what happened is two things we are highlighting in that conference about Syria. One is that the conflict in Syria is entered into fourth year now, and 140,000 people have lost their lives, and about a few million have gone as refugees in the neighboring countries of Jordan, Turkey and Lebanon, and there is no sign of any peace agreement. The other thing we are highlighting, that something happened in the history of the world which never happened before, which was the UK present government did not get a mandate or authorization to go to war. So this was, as far as I know, is the single episode in history. And because of us, the US, Obama didn't get approval from the anti-war movement and others, he didn't get approval. So for the first time in history, there was no intervention, no engagement, no Europeans or the US in together going to war. So these two things we are highlighting, and also trying to explore, can we carry on with this and see if we have no more, if there is a situation like Syria comes up. So we will try in the peace movement best that we do not have a situation where it's so easy to go to war as the French were raring to go this time.
Oh yeah, so they were. And intervention, very rarely, if ever, you can probably tell us, but I can't think of one case where intervention's actually helped.
Same.
You know, you cannot extend democracy with a gun. So, but you get establishment support. You see, that's what intrigues me, because Stop the War, you know, they're sort of regarded as sort of lepers. I hope that's not offensive to anyone who's used that phrase. And you know, I spoke to a friend of mine. You know, he's very influential. He says you cannot get Stop the War even onto Newsnight, which is about the most liberal show on British TV. I mean, what's your secret?
After saying that Stop the War do not get a wider coverage, which I would agree with you, although they've been on BBC and some other channels. The effect the Stop the War has is quite humongous, it's big. Because I remember, probably you were and maybe some of you were, on that march before the start of the Iraq war on 15th of February, and I was one of them. And the march wasn't going anywhere, and because we came to know this, we are on the biggest march in history. That's why. And then we later on came to know every hour Tony Blair in 10 Downing Street was getting a report where the marches were. Okay, we were not able to stop the war on Iraq, but what we did was 6 months we delayed it. And I personally feel that because of the peace movement's opposition to Iraq war, we didn't have Britain going to war in Syria, because shall we say it's a fallout? Shall we say it's the beginning of a new era? We may be at the tipping point of history where, because what happens is ordinary people, ordinary public have gone war weary. And you can see when the debate happened on Syria, member after member of parliament stood up and say, please do not engage us another war, because we had enough of war for the last 100 years. It's very interesting. You probably read that article which appeared in the Guardian, because we are commemorating the First World War, which happened in 1914. And that article was very revealing in the sense that it said that from 1914 to 2014, Britain has always, without fail, without interruption, on war each and every year for 100 years.
One war or another somewhere.
Sometimes two,
Particularly America.
running two wars like Iraq and Afghanistan.
Yeah. And the Cold War,
And the Cold War
which
and
was very bloody. It wasn't just cold. And millions
20
of people lost their lives
over
in
20
Indonesia
million.
during the Cold War, didn't they?
Over 20 million.
Slaughtered.
Because we were not fighting each other, but we were fighting in different countries, different
Yeah.
places.
The
Here-
Europeans are quite a warlike people, really, aren't they? If they're not fighting each other, they're fighting, as you say. Well, that's all we've got time to for this part of the interview,
Okay.
but we'll be continuing a little bit later. And thanks very much for talking to us so far. And that's the end of this show. So thank you, everybody, for watching. Thank you to the People's Voice for screening us. You can see our other shows on the RADTV UK YouTube channel. RADTV UK will find us if you search for that. And see you next time.